Hello and welcome to the show. Today we're diving into the complex and often controversial world of Zionism and Israeli propaganda. Now, before you grab your phone to argue in the comments section, let's be clear. Criticizing a nation-state's actions or policies is not inherently anti-Semitic. However, when those actions involve the systematic oppression and dispossession of another group of people, it's not just fair game for criticism, it's practically begging for it. And believe me, when it comes to this particular topic, there's a whole lot to unpack. Over the next hour, we'll explore the dozen Ds, 12 common propaganda tactics that are frequently used to shape public perception and narratives about Israel and Palestine. These tactics often rely on emotional appeals, selective information, and outright distortions to influence public opinion. We're going to break them down one by one, providing you with the context and critical thinking skills to see through the fog of propaganda. Now, I know what you're thinking. John, this all sounds very serious and depressing. And you're right, it is. But just like a colonoscopy, sometimes you have to delve into the unpleasant bits to understand what's really going on. So buckle up, because it's going to be a bumpy, thought-provoking, and hopefully eye-opening ride. Our first D is for delegitimization. This tactic aims to undermine the Palestinian narrative by portraying them as a fictional people, a group that never formed a distinct national identity or had their own state in history. It's a classic "they never existed" argument, often deployed to justify the displacement and dispossession of a population. Palestinian historian, think about it. If you can convince people that Palestinians aren't a real people with a legitimate claim to the land, then the entire conversation about their rights, their history, their struggle, simply evaporates. It's like trying to have property rights to a house that, according to the person trying to evict you, doesn't exist. This tactic relies heavily on historical revisionism, cherry-picking certain facts while ignoring others, and presenting a skewed version of events. It conveniently forgets the centuries of Palestinian presence in the region, their rich culture, and their own narrative of connection to the land. Palestinian historian. Imagine for a moment someone walking into your home, claiming it was built on land promised to them by a being no one can see or speak to, and then telling you that not only do you have no right to be there, but you never did. Because, you see, you don't actually exist. That, my friends, is the essence of delegitimization, and it's as absurd as it is insidious. Moving on to our next D, we have discrediting Palestinians. This tactic goes hand in hand with delegitimization and involves painting an entire population with a broad, negative brush, portraying them as inherently violent, untrustworthy, and driven by anti-Semitism. International journalist. Think of it as the propaganda equivalent of labeling an entire neighborhood as a bad part of town to justify avoiding it altogether. Except in this case, the neighborhood is an entire people, and the consequences are far more dire than just avoiding a few streets. This tactic thrives on fear-mongering and relies heavily on stereotypes. It often manifests in media portrayals of Palestinians as terrorists, religious fanatics, or backwards people incapable of peaceful coexistence. These depictions are then used to justify discriminatory policies, military actions, and the denial of basic human rights. International journalist? It's a bit like refusing to hire someone because of their ethnicity or religion, and then justifying your bigotry by pointing to a news article about a crime committed by someone who shares that same background. It's lazy, it's dangerous, and it completely ignores the vast majority of Palestinians who just want to live in peace and dignity. The reality is, like any population group, Palestinians are diverse. They hold a wide range of political views, religious beliefs, and personal aspirations. To paint them all with the same brush of extremism is not only inaccurate, it's dehumanizing and ultimately serves to maintain the status quo of inequality. Chapter 3. Deflecting from discussing legality or morality. Our third D is a real crowd pleaser: deflection. This tactic is all about shifting the conversation away from any uncomfortable scrutiny of Israel's actions or the legality and morality of Zionist ideology.
Instead of addressing legitimate concerns about human rights violations, international law, or the plight of Palestinians living under occupation, this tactic relies on redirecting attention to Israel's positive attributes, often completely unrelated to the issue at hand. It's the geopolitical equivalent of your friend changing the subject when you bring up that time they borrowed your car and returned it with a dented bumper and an empty gas tank.
It's a masterful display of whataboutism on a global scale. Suddenly, a conversation about illegal settlements becomes a lecture about Israel's technological advancements.
And any mention of Palestinian suffering is quickly countered with pronouncements of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. A discussion about the blockade of Gaza morphs into a history lesson about Jewish persecution throughout the centuries.
It's a classic bait and switch, designed to shut down critical thinking and stifle any meaningful debate. It's like trying to have a conversation with a magician who keeps pulling rabbits out of a hat every time you ask a difficult question. Sure, the rabbits are cute, but they don't change the fact that you're still waiting for an answer.
This deflection tactic is incredibly effective because it plays on people's emotions and their desire for simple answers to complex problems.
Chapter 4. Sowing doubts about legal or historical realities. Buckle up, folks, because our fourth D, sowing doubts, is a real doozy. This tactic is all about creating confusion and uncertainty around well-established legal and historical facts.
It's the intellectual equivalent of mud wrestling. Get down in the dirt, stir things up, and hope no one notices the lack of actual substance. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this tactic manifests in various ways. One common approach is to challenge the historical narrative of Palestinian displacement, questioning the extent to which it occurred or even denying it altogether.
Another tactic is to cast doubt on the legal basis for Palestinian claims, arguing that international law is somehow biased against Israel or that previous agreements are no longer valid.
But here's the thing, historical facts and legal precedents are not like opinions on pizza toppings. It's like trying to argue your way out of a speeding ticket by claiming the speed limit signs are just suggestions and that everyone else was going just as fast. This tactic thrives on ambiguity and thrives in the murky waters of historical interpretation.
By muddying the waters and presenting alternative narratives, often with little to no factual basis, this tactic aims to create a sense of uncertainty and make it seem as though both sides of the story are equally valid.
There's a reason why we have historians and legal scholars, and it's not just to provide us with conflicting viewpoints for entertainment purposes.
Chapter 5. Dehumanizing Palestinians. Our fifth D, dehumanizing Palestinians, is perhaps the most insidious and dangerous of all. This tactic seeks to strip Palestinians of their humanity, portraying them as less than human and therefore undeserving of empathy, compassion, or basic rights.
This tactic often relies on portraying Palestinians as inherently violent, barbaric, and even animalistic. They are often depicted as terrorists, religious fanatics, or a threat to civilization itself. This dehumanization is used to justify the most brutal and inhumane treatment, making it easier to rationalize violence, oppression, and even ethnic cleansing.
Imagine, if you will, a world where an entire group of people is consistently portrayed as cockroaches, rats, or venomous snakes. How would you feel about seeing those images plastered across newspapers and television screens? How would it shape your perception of that group?
Now, imagine that this dehumanizing rhetoric is used to justify policies that confine those people to overcrowded enclaves, deny them basic necessities like clean water and electricity, and subject them to constant military incursions.
They are not seen as human beings with hopes, dreams, and families, but as a problem to be managed, controlled, or eliminated. The use of dehumanizing language and imagery is a hallmark of propaganda aimed at inciting hatred and justifying violence.
It is a tactic that has been used throughout history to justify the most horrific atrocities, and it is a tactic that should never be tolerated or ignored.